And breaking news out of Baltimore. Just a couple of minutes from now, we expect to hear from Baltimore City State Attorney Marilyn Mosby. She'll be speaking about the Freddie Gray investigation. As you can see, the podium has been set up. The microphones are all there. We're just expecting for this news conference to start about 6 minutes from now. We'll, of course, be bringing it to you live. But I want to bring in James Peterson, Director of Africana Studies and Associate Professor of English at Lehigh University, as well as MSNBC contributor. Michael Skolnick is President of Global Grind, and legal analyst Brian Claypool. Thank you all for being with me. Let's start with you, Professor. What we're expecting today at this news conference and how that can help clarify things for something that seems to be so set in stone, the investigation, it must be kept secret, and that's how the justice system works. Is this going to be a step towards us understanding what we can expect?
We have to see exactly what she's going to say here, Jose. I mean, unfortunately, the lack of transparency, whether it's for legal proceedings or not, has really exacerbated the situation for us nationally as well as locally there in Baltimore, because people need to understand what the pathways to justice are going to be. The State Attorney Mosby now is going to, I hope, let us know whether or not she believes there's enough evidence in this case to actually prosecute the law enforcement officers who were handling or mishandling Mr. Freddie Gray in the last few moments of his life. And so, you know, this is a tense moment, Jose. We have to see exactly what she's going to say. And obviously, there are people waiting to hear that the state will be able to prosecute this case, because most folk in Baltimore and nationally believe that that's the pathway towards justice.
Yeah, and Brian, I mean, the fact is that there are some steps that need to be taken in order for the justice to be served.
Well, Jose, I agree with that, but I also disagree with the fact that this information regarding the investigation should not be released to the public. This is a poster child case where evidence as it flows out should be given to the public. It's such a volatile situation. Tensions are percolating, not only Baltimore, but nationwide. We need to have this information. And I'll tell you why, Jose.
But Brian, let me ask you, but if you do that when it's just beginning, if you do that when just they're starting to start the process, and I'm sorry about the repetitive nature of that, is that a time to be bringing information out which may or may not at the end be useful?
Yes, for two reasons. Number one, we have a public safety risk not only in Baltimore, but nationwide with excessive force being used by law enforcement. So my argument would be public safety trumps preserving the fidelity of a criminal investigation. And the second reason why is because you saw yesterday, the police, I know it's probably the police department or the police commission releases this Houdini proposition that Freddie Gray somehow harmed himself and created the severed spine. That's why you need to release all of the information now for the public and not bits and pieces.
And Michael, this is something that I think a lot of people look at and say, well, why don't I have the information? I mean, if you guys completed an investigation, let me see at least what you got so far.
Well, I think, Jose, that has been the issue, you know, since in decades and of years of this country, and certainly since the death of Mike Brown. This idea of transparency, constantly we are fighting our government, our own government, to get information about us. Whether it's police body cameras, we're not getting access to those. Whether it's an investigation, one of the officers we understand in Baltimore has not spoken to the investigators. You know, we're waiting constantly, and then of course the Baltimore police, the NYPD, the Ferguson police leak this information about the victim that is inflammatory and creates even more hostile situations while we are waiting for the honest truth of what actually happened in Freddie Gray's death.
And James, the other side of the coin is, of course, if you are arrested or detained and you are innocent, do you want that information to be made public, regardless of who you are, before the final investigation on what you did or didn't do is completed? Is this something that we should demand as a society, that everybody, regardless of what happens, if there is a process against you, we want to know all the information and we want that public?
Well, given if I were alive to be able to speak for myself, then maybe I can make a sort of determination about the facts in any particular case related to me personally. But our other guests on the panel here are absolutely right, Jose, which is there is a public good, public interest sensibility to these cases that must be taken into consideration. At the end of the day, there is no trust. The trust between the community and law enforcement has been completely eroded by the steady series of these murders of unarmed, mostly black men across the nation. And so we have to be sensitive to the particular moment. And the public good suggests that we need to have access and transparency immediately.
But even before the final investigation is completed, we need to have information that's maybe partial?
As Michael pointed out, Jose, if they weren't leaking information that seemed to be to the detriment of some of the victims of some of these crimes, if they weren't playing with the media and the release of information in such a way that exacerbated the hostilities, then maybe we could be more patient in terms of transparency in terms of these cases overall. Patience is gone. Trust is gone. The pathway to restoring those things requires transparency right now.
And Brian, that would include then releasing information of an investigation before the final determination is made.
Well, absolutely. And Jose, make no mistake about it. If this were an average person on the street and they did this to Freddie Gray, they would have already been arrested. The fact of the matter is, I believe, even taking off my lawyer hat, there's enough evidence, as I see it already, to at least indict these police officers for criminal negligence. Let's hold off on the severing of his spine, which I think did happen outside the van. Let's even put that aside for a moment until we get the autopsy report. And criminal negligence in Maryland can stem from the failure to perform a duty that's mandated by law. Here, that duty was to call for medical help. It's obvious that Freddie Gray, over those 40 minutes, was dying in that van, asked for medical help. They didn't call for medical help. In Maryland, that's criminal negligence. These officers should be indicted.
And Michael, the folks on the ground that aren't following the minutia of the investigation, because as we've been pointing out, it's, not public, I think they do feel as though no one is taking care of them and no one is informing them and no one is worried about they who feel slighted, who feel that they've been affected by this, are kept informed of what's going on.
I mean, Jose, just a month ago, I know we are outraged over the death of Freddie Gray, but just a month ago, we saw a video of a man being shot in the back in South Carolina, Walter Scott. And this country, bar none, was outraged. The cover of Time magazine, the cover of New York Times, saying, Black Lives Matter, this is outrageous. This cop was arrested immediately. And white people like myself and white communities saw this and said, whoa, maybe black people are telling the truth. Maybe actually we should start to believe them. Maybe actually they're not telling lies. Maybe the cops are actually killing innocent people. Maybe that's actually happening in our country right now. And just a month later, the cover of the New York Times, the cover of Time magazine, another unarmed black man killed in this country. As white Americans, as all Americans, we have to wake up and realize this is happening. This is not about some guy telling a lie or some family making up a story. This man was killed. We want to know what happened, and we want to know what happened now.
And Jose, one quick coda to what Michael and Brian are saying here. Remember, this is a community and a nation where we're seeing aggressive law enforcement, aggressive policing. The most aggressive kind of policing is going on in Baltimore. They're hunting people down in Baltimore. How can we sort of ignore that aggressive nature and be patient to get the information required around these cases when we can see how aggressive law enforcement can be when they're pursuing us as civilians?
But you know what, James? I mean, the fact is that elected officials, and they're elected to represent us in the community, they do represent the folks that are voting for them in Baltimore and in Maryland. And so what responsibility do elected officials have to clean up their system, to make sure that the people they oversee are actually doing their job? And if there are some, or maybe just one or two people that are mishandling or misusing their authority, that they be taken out and that they're taken out of the system. What a responsibility do elected officials have in representing the folks they are elected by?
They have tremendous responsibility, Jose, and elected officials of Baltimore have got to come to terms with two things. One, the systems have been corrosive for a long, long time, for decades, if not scores of years, and so they're inheriting some of these problems, and so they have to realize the systematic nature of them and address them accordingly. Being representative these days is less about the money that's in politics that's controlling elections and more about whether or not you can connect to the people.
Yeah, and go ahead.
Jose, if I could add to that, right? This isn't about a bad seed or a bad apple or, one or two bad cops in the department.
That's right.
This is about a 40-year war against black and brown America that we have coded as a war on drugs and a failed war. This is about, you want to talk about violence in West Baltimore? Poverty is violence. Bad education is violence. Lack of jobs is violence.
Yeah, but look,
there's a lot of violence in West Baltimore.
Look, to say that the police are at war with civilians or with is, I think, a very strong statement when you have a lot of officers that are putting their lives on the line every single day for people, and they're African-American officers and they're Latino officers that go in there and do their job brilliantly every day.
The system has been created to fight a war against their own people. It's not a police department. It's a policy system that says broken windows policy, quality of life. Why was Freddie Gray even stopped?
Exactly.
Why?
Well, we don't know that. That's part of the investigation, right?
And that's crazy.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Gentlemen, I'm being told that we have about 30 seconds before this press conference starts, and this is a conversation that we're going to continue having. I appreciate your passion and your perspective on this. I just don't want you to lose that, but I just wanted to let you know